Um, for those of you who didn't join in earlier sessions, the theme for our 2021 Conservation Summit is Caring for the Land. We've had several really interesting and good presentations throughout the summit, and tonight in the keynote presentation, Judy is going to work to wrap them all together and engage us in some very good discussions, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Before we get started, let me see if I can advance this. Some Zoom protocols, I guess. If you would, make sure that you keep your microphone muted so as not to distract during the presentations, except that when Judy is speaking, she's going to be inviting open discussion. So at that point in time, you'll want to make sure you're unmuted if you want to participate in the discussion. We would also appreciate it if everybody is comfortable to keep your camera on, because unlike our conservation summits when we're in person, we're not able to sit and look at each other and talk to each other and hug those people that we haven't seen for a year and shake hands and things like that. So if we have our cameras on, that's about as close as we can get to having an in-person summit. And hopefully next year, we will be able to go back to in-person summits again. So if you're comfortable, keep your camera on. If you're familiar with Zoom, which I'm sure everybody is because we use it so much today, the chat room will be open, so you can post questions or comments in the chat, and we will be doing our best to respond and answer to any questions. Just ask that everybody is always respectful in what they post in the chat. And then during the session, when things are opened up for discussion, you can use a button. There's a reactions button that's got a red square around it that you can use to raise your hand if you want to participate, if you have a comment, if you have a question, you use that function. Okay. Let me tell you a little bit about the Association of Vermont Conservation Commissions. Don't know how much the folks on this meeting do or don't know about us. We're a nonprofit organization, and our mission is to support Vermont's conservation commissions and encourage the establishment of more conservation commissions in the state. You can see by the little map that's on the screen, we have a fair amount of conservation commissions out there, but there's also a lot of towns that don't have conservation commissions. So if a town is interested in forming a conservation commission, we will certainly work with them to help one get started. We're a membership organization with the conservation commissions can join voluntarily and support us through their membership fees. The AVCC, or the Association of Vermont Conservation Commissions, was founded in 1990. It's overseen by a board of volunteer directors. As I said, we rely on membership dues to support our work. And some of our work is hosting the annual Conservation Summit, like we have done every year, the last 2 years being virtually. We provide tiny grants to conservation commissions to help them with their what I'd call on-the-ground work in their town. We maintain a website with a lot of tools on it to help conservation commissions. We share success stories and we help promote relevant events. And also there's information on there for conservation commissions to help them do their work. The next slide, I'd like to thank our sponsors for this summit this year. They're listed on the screen. Many of them are repeat sponsors from prior years, but we very much appreciate their contributions to making our summit successful. I'm going to formally open our annual meeting now, and we'll hold our annual meeting, and then I will turn it over to Judy for the keynotes discussion tonight. There is not a lot to cover in our annual meeting, so it'll be fairly brief. I do want to point out, normally there is a board chair report, okay? This year, like last year, has been interesting, I guess, for lack of a better term, because of our inability to get together and work in person. We have continued to meet on a regular basis as a board. We gave out tiny grants this year as we have in previous years. But one of the big accomplishments of this year was that the Vermont Conservation Commission Handbook, and I'm going to go to the next slide, has been thoroughly revised, completely revised. And it's now digital. It's on our website. We had some folks contact us. Someone in particular had found some old printed versions of the old Conservation Commission Handbook. Much of that information was out of date. So thanks primarily to Jens's leadership and then some other folks, the Conservation Commission Handbook has been completely updated. It is digital. It is on our website. The link is at the bottom of this slide, but if you go to our website, you can easily find the link. It's got a lot of new content in it, and I would suggest everybody go look at it and utilize it. If you have questions about it, please let us know by emailing us. It also, one of the things in this Conservation Commission Handbook, it has over 40 what we call success stories, which is where a Conservation Commission shares the results of their work and their success. And in those stories, they might talk a little about some of the challenges they had, how they came up with the ideas, what work efforts it took, and who they needed to engage to accomplish what they did. I find them very useful, and the purpose of posting them and making them available is for other conservation commissions to learn or to get ideas on things they might work on their own. And I would really ask that everyone on this meeting for your own conservation commissions, all of you have success stories. All of you are doing great things. Feel free to submit your success story through our website. It really helps us all to learn and grow. So that was a big accomplishment this year. Let's see. So I'm going to go back to the prior slide. The other thing we need to do at this annual meeting is we always have, so briefly, our financials. Let me talk about that. And I'm going to use our September financial report. The Association of Vermont Conservation Commissions, we don't have a big budget. We don't have a lot of money. And as I said, we're member supported. But to share with everyone, our assets as of September were $4,059. Our income through September was $1,522 with expenses of $190. Now, our expenses were very low this year as they were last year because our Conservation Summit, our annual summit, is virtual, not in person. So we don't incur a lot of the expenses we do when we have an in-person meeting. So that is our financial report. We're in good shape. We're in the red, and so we're moving forward. And as I said, we do depend on membership fees. So if your Conservation Commission is not a member, please have a discussion and consider becoming a member. The other thing we do in our annual meetings is board elections, and this year, there are 2 board seats that are up for re-election, but we're only going to be voting on one because Matt Lacey, who was one of the board seats up for re-election, he's moved to Wyoming and he's decided to step down, and we will greatly miss Matt. But it means we have an open board seat. So I will throw this out there. If folks are interested in learning more about being on our board and learning more about what we do and would be interested in contributing, please let us know. You can email us through the link that's on our website, and we can talk to you more about it. The other board seat that's up for election is myself. My term is up, and I'm standing for re-election to the board. And so with that, we will now open it up. And my bio is on the website. I think it went out also in one of the emails about this meeting. So I enjoy being on the AVCC board, find it challenging and rewarding work, and would like to continue. So with that, I guess technically we need a motion on the slate of seats that are up for election, which would be 1, myself.
Mark, I'd like to make the motion to approve the slate as recommended.
Thank you.
Is there a second? Help us out, please.
Somebody be willing to second that one? I see.
Thank you, Bethany.
Thank you. Unfortunately, your name's not showing up, so thank you for seconding. So at this point, I would ask everybody to unmute yourself, and I'm going to ask all in favor, say aye.
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 Aye. Anyone opposed, say nay, please. Okay, does anyone want to abstain? Let us know that. Okay, hearing no nays or abstentions, then the motion has passed. Thank you, everybody, and I look forward to continuing on the board.
Hey.
Let's see. How did that come up? Okay, so time to get to our keynote speaker. I've got up here a list of what the prior sessions were. Judy opened up the annual summit with a discussion about going through the Narrows. Judy then listened in on every other session that we've had. And what she's going to do tonight is she's going to be pulling all of the presentations together. She'll be encouraging everybody to participate in the discussion. And really what we want to take away from this is, I'm going to use Judy's terms. What did we get from the gifts of knowledge that were shared with us during these previous presentations? And how are we going to take them and turn them into action? So Judy's going to be talking to us, but it really will be, we are encouraging active discussion on this about where we're going to go with this information we learned. I'm not going to reread Judy's bio because it was in the email, it was on the website, and it went through it at the first session. I will just say, I know Judy as a fellow VNRC board member. That's where we've met. And I will say this, that every time I'm in a meeting with Judy or on a phone call with her, or if we do a Zoom meeting together, I walk away with a new piece of knowledge, a new gift of knowledge from Judy, and also a challenge of maybe thinking about things differently in a different way than I have in the past. And that, that's what we wanted people to take away from this year's annual summit about caring for the land. Not just thinking about things the way we have in the past and we always have, but challenging ourselves, is there a different way for caring for the land, and what is the best thing for the land? So anyway, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Judy. And Judy, thank you for joining us tonight. Oh, and you know what, Judy, what's best for me to leave up so it's not a distraction to you?
Let's put our faces up so we can see each other, the ones who talk.
Okay, so let me stop sharing then. There we go.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I really do hope this is a discussion. I've been to lots of annual meetings, and it's kind of nice to sit back with your cup of tea or your glass of wine or whatever and just talk, because you haven't seen people a long time. So let's see if we can create that atmosphere where we're sitting back and talking. So the very first session, some of you might remember, I talked about going through the Narrows and how we live in a world where there's a limited number of plants and animals and birds and fish and so on. And because of climate change, we're going through this tight spot. We're going through these Narrows into a new world. And in that new world, all systems will be broken as we know it. Every system we know will be broken. And we're going to help many through the Narrows. They're not going to be able to make it. And so in listening to the other conversations from people, I was like, everything they were saying was like, yes, right on. Let's help these people, even the animals, right? The first presenter we had was Professor Bill Keaton. And he talked about sequestering carbon and the importance of carbon in our tree, in the ground, in our trees, in storing it for us. And it was really an interesting conversation, I thought. And so my first question is, how can we work to develop old growth forests in our community? So let me just give you an example. In my community, anybody here from Essex? No, hey, no. So in my community, we have this place called Indian Brook. And there's a park there and a reserve. And there's this one location way up in the woods that a farmer 100 years ago planted 2 black locusts on either side of his driveway. And black locusts live to almost 150 years old. And these are well over 100 years old. And what happened is there are now 11 generations of black locusts in this one grove. And black locust is native to the Appalachian Mountains, but as with everything else, they're walking north with climate change. So they're pretty happy here right now. They've walked up the Appalachian Trail and came right here into our backyard. Some people call them invasive because they're not native, but who cares? If we have an acre of old growth forest that's over 100 years old, and it's this big vessel that's holding the carbon, what could be better? What could be better, right? And these colonies are another thing. These big old colonies of sumac, big old colonies of strawberry patches, they're holding huge amounts of carbon because they're one plant and they're clones of all the others around it. And so underneath, they're holding huge amounts of carbon. So thinking about that question, what could you do in your community to highlight the importance of old growth or colony type trees and vegetation? Anything anybody can think of in their community they might want to do? They might want to bring that nugget of knowledge that we got from Professor Keaton. Okay, you need some more wine. Let's see, Linda.
I wasn't able to attend that session, but I can tell you that we're working on our town plan in Guilford, and old growth forests have been a topic in our review of the old town plan, and we did introduce them in this cycle of the town plan. And I would say those of us on the Conservation Commission have more understanding of what an old growth forest is. And we describe them in our town plan. And when we mapped our forest blocks, we noted which ones might be good candidates for allowing parts of those forests to be unmanaged. So that's
Awesome.
one strategy.
Awesome, that's great, Linda, that's really good. Yeah, old growth in Guilford, the Franklins, right? The Franklin farms. There you go. You got some old growth there. And so all those big old trees around there are just amazing. And the fact that you recognize the importance of that and that you want to start preserving it is wonderful. But also think of these, you know how people think of sumac and box elder as like waste? Cut them down, they're on the side of the road, they're waste. They're not, they're colonies, they're huge mechanisms for storing carbon. So think about those colonies as well. Great job. Anybody else?
So talking about invasives now, is that a good way of looking at buckthorn, that it is actually storing carbon? Is that the gift that they're bringing to us?
You know, that is such an interesting conversation, and I'm not sure you'll like my answer. But to Native people, they're a tree or a plant is not invasive, it's introduced. So think back 14,000 years. I know you're not that old, but think back to what we learned in school 14,000 years ago. What was here? 2 miles of
Ice.
ice, right? 2
Ice,
miles of
right.
ice, right? When that ice receded, there was no soil here. There were no plants here. So every plant has been introduced at one time or another. And history is full of these stories. Hawkweed, they used to say in the early 1900s, go out and put salt on the hawkweed. Canadian hawkweed is coming down from Canada, and it's going to take over. But the thing of it is it will eventually find balance. It's just that we are too impatient for it to find balance.
Yeah.
And so that's why people are like, pull their heads off, get rid of them, introduce this bug, that'll get rid of them, introduce that, that'll get rid of them. But the thing about doing all of that is that you sometimes introduce another problem, right? And so for me personally, there are indigenous plants and there are introduced plants, and indigenous people have always, as soon as an introduced plant has come, they have adapted to use that plant. Let me give you an example. Apple trees are not indigenous. And anybody with a big old pasture knows they're going to have apple trees popping up all over the place after you get done with the cows, feeding the cows and the horses, whatever, apples, right? Are you going to call them invasive? And if we're looking at equity, for all living things, which the guiding principles for the Climate Council say fairness to all living and non-living things. If we're going to be looking at equity, substitute people in with for that plant that you want to pull out, or that plant you want to call invasive. You wouldn't call people invasive, right? And so for me, it's hard to call it invasive. And here's another example. Our state flower, red clover, is in a place of honor, but in Missouri and Kentucky, it's on the invasive plant list. So every state has their own god that sits in their capital that decides what's invasive and what's not. So I told you it would be different. It wasn't, my friend calls me the worldview disruptor. I never have the answer anybody wants. But that's a good question. But so buckthorn.
Judy, did you see that Eric has his hand up too? Sorry to interrupt. Just want to make sure you were checking that.
No, I don't see. Oh, there you are. Oh, yellow hand. I didn't see it, Eric. Let me just, oh, never mind. I lost it. But invasive is a touchy subject that needs to be looked at from many perspectives. But,
Thanks, Judy.
yeah.
So a couple of thoughts and comments. Definitely a thought on the invasive species element or concept, but also I want to go way back to your initial question to the group here about what the local towns are doing. And I'll just share that in the town of Williston. I'm on the Williston Conservation Commission, and as you know, a few of you know, I'm also here for my day job as the director of the Lake Champlain Basin Program. But where my Conservation Commission hat at the moment, we work closely with the town on developing different conservation layers. In fact, we're almost wrapped up a project here with Yentz after, I don't know, how long's it been, Yentz? A year or more? To develop a significant wildlife habitat layer. And that kind of layer, I think, is where we could, at least in Williston anyway, we could incorporate your idea, a very good idea about identifying old growth forest areas. And I don't know off the top of my head where we would have them, but I'm sure we have at least a few small patches here and there. I know that we have some what are those giant trees called that used to mark property boundaries?
Witness
I don't
trees.
know. Yes,
Witness trees.
yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, something like that. But anyway, so that's that's an interesting idea that I'll bring back to the Conservation Commission.
Nice.
On the invasive species front, all right, putting my Lake Champlain Basin Program hat on now. In our world, and working with the government and all of that, I have to go by their definition of invasive species, which is, and I think we've talked about this before, which is a species that will cause economic harm or harm public health in some way or ecological harm.
Mhm.
And I understand that. I definitely understand and appreciate your perspective on the fact that everything is new to some degree, whether it's in the last 2 years or since the area was covered by glaciers. But for me in my day job, we have to think about it in terms of the federal government definition.
Yeah.
And manage the Lake Champlain resource anyway to that extent. But that aside, I'm fortunate to have my neighbor owns 90 acres or so of land behind me and lets us walk through their property. And I just in the past couple of years, I've watched buckthorn explode back there, and to the point where now in the spring, particularly this spring, I noticed that before anything else was leafed out, it was a whole layer of green about, I can't see the screen, but about 2 feet high, and it was almost almost like a 2 foot high carpet of buckthorn back there, and I just have to ask, so that's presumably could be replacing other species that could be providing some other benefit to the other animals, plants and animals
Well,
in
and
the area.
it's clearly reducing diversity, which is another amazing way to store carbon, right? Yeah.
Yes,
So,
yes,
yeah. So, I mean, there has to be balance. We have to find a happy balance. We can't go around and go through Williston and pick out every buckthorn. We just can't do it. But
right.
there are places where that has to be done to have diversity for whatever the field's going to be used for sure. Yeah. And what I like about Williston too is so at the end of Walker Hill Road and the corner of South Vernal and Walker Hill Road is my grandmother's farm. The Lacasse
okay.
farm. That's my grandmother.
Yep.
And
Wow,
and what I really like about what Williston is working so hard to prevent fragmentation of land.
trying.
Yes. And
We're
I just
trying,
love
yep.
that. I just love that they're working so hard on that. That's great.
Yep.
Okay, so any other comments on that? Because I have, he also talked about diversity in our forests and the importance of having projects to create diversity. And I grew up in this generation, he didn't mention this, but I grew up in this generation where you followed the rules of Smokey the Bear. There was no burning, right? But I know indigenous communities across this country work very hard to burn and maintain their forest through burning. And matter of fact, I have friends from Lame Deer in Montana, and they're smoke jumpers, and they came here and they just about had a heart attack with our ground litter, the amount of ground litter that we have on our grounds. And they're like, aren't you worried about fire? And I'm like, are you kidding? We're so wet. But we're not. We're now going down that path of change. And they may be getting a lot of rain in the south, but we're not getting a lot in the north. And there was drought this summer. Have any of you considered burning processes to promote diversity in your forests? Within your communities? Because good old Smokey the Bear is right there, right? He's telling you not to. But it's such an old traditional ecological knowledge technique to promote diversity and good health within your forests? I was just curious. Nobody's.
I was up in Victory Basin with the Fish and Wildlife Department land managers there, and we have been burning several parcels there for blueberry, and we actually no longer have enough. We don't know enough people that have their fire certificates that can do controlled burns. So we're sort of losing those skills. There just aren't enough people in Vermont who are certified to do it in the government.
Yeah, that's too bad. What about the possibility of forming some way to train people to do that? Because it adds such diversity to your forests to do that. I mean, I have seen people burn, use coppicing where they've cut down growth in their forests. And the next year, you can't even tell it's the same forest. It's totally different because it's so diverse. And diversity in our forest, again, is going to help with storage of carbon. It's critical. So those are some of the questions I got from Mr. Keaton. Let's
Judy?
see. Yeah.
Could I just ask a question on what
Sure.
you're talking about with the burning, when you're comparing it to what the indigenous folks did? But our forests right now are not the same as it was at the point in time when the indigenous folks were doing the burning. In other words, our forests are still in what we would call the recovery stage.
Mm-hmm.
So do we also need to balance that with letting our forests kind of fully recover and creating diversity on their own, you know what I mean, versus trying to do something that maybe was appropriate at one time when we had lots of old growth forest around, but we have a forest that's recovering right now? Just a thought, not meant to
Well,
disagree
there's
with
a
what you're
no,
saying.
I love it. I love it. There's a really good movie out called Inhabitants, and it's about indigenous people using old traditional ecological knowledge to maintain the land today. And one of the things they're doing today is controlled burning in their forests. It's a wonderful movie. And it'll show you, it breaks down into different kinds of traditional ecological knowledge, like growing a garden in the middle of a desert. They plant, like a foot deep where the water level is. And they get a whole complete garden. They don't just dig down an inch and plant the seeds. So there's all amazing old techniques that they're reclaiming and using today. And burning is one of them.
Thank you. And that is called Inhabitants?
Mm-hmm. Inhabitants.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
It's really good. Yes, it says Aaron, but I don't think you're Aaron.
I'm Aaron. Yeah, that is a really beautiful conversation. Thank you, Judy.
Thank you.
And I guess what I wanted to share is, so on our rare and endangered plant list for the state of Vermont, quite a number of those plants, I can't speak to the carbon storage aspect, but quite a number of our plants on the list are species that are fire adapted, that have seeds that probably live a really long time waiting for the next fire to come, or other
Yes.
such disturbance. And some of them survive now in power line rights of ways, or in actually there's a lot in Williston and Essex, since you're mentioning those towns, but power line rights of ways, fire adapted places, and also that the Green Mountain National Forest still does do a lot of burning, and some of those are in areas areas that I'm sure have been burning historically for a long, we have records of them burning at least up to 1904 or something, quite regularly. And one of those sites that they burnt recently, there's a threatened orchid species that grows there that has gone gangbusters ever since they've been burning. And there are other sorts of disturbances actually that can also cause these orchids to, I think, just sort of logging just in sort of the right amount of thinning, but not actually removing the canopy, we found also can have a really positive effect for these orchids, but burning really just made them so happy, it seems.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. So the next speaker we had was, I'm not sure I'll say it right. Zabatra, Courage, and Lynn McNamara. And they addressed balancing the different goals of land stewardship. And Zabatra guided us through a conversation around balancing recreation and ecological goals. And she suggested we maintain and restore conditions where possible. Her goals were targeted rare species, which Erin was just alluding to, wetlands, and freshwater communities. And Lynn focused on things such as dogs on sensitive trails and disruption of vernal pools and the impacts on frogs, toads, and salamanders. And so I had a couple questions after watching that, and I was curious. One of the things that I have noticed in Burlington, because I do a lot of outdoor classes with kids, and one of the things I noticed was a huge absence of vernal pools this year. And the little newts were wandering around dazed and confused, knowing that there should be a vernal pool here, and there wasn't one. And they just wandered around and wandered around. Have you guys noticed an absence of vernal pools where you live? No? Do you all know what a vernal pool is? It's, do you want to explain it, Jens? No, go ahead. It's like this pool that happens in the spring, and frogs will come and lay their eggs, and salamanders will come and do their things, and then by midsummer it disappears, maybe even earlier than midsummer, but it's back the next year. And so year after year after year, these critters go back and lay their eggs and do their changes that they do in these vernal pools. And up north, I mean, in Burlington, I noticed 3 of the standard vernal pools that I bring kids to were dried up. They were dried up by April.
Yeah, I noticed the same thing, Judy, here in Burlington, in the north end of Burlington as well. There was definitely a lack of the typical spring pools that you see where frogs congregate and other amphibians congregate because of the conditions were so dry.
Yeah, and I'm sure that is a result of climate change as well, but it's going to make an impact if all these little critters can't reproduce on the food chain that they're a part of, right? And so I just think somewhere back in your communities, you need to also kind of keep track of the vernal pools, what's happening there. And one of the questions I had was about that is, do most of you have naturalists or educators with your parks and recs who go to these places, who could tell you where the vernal pools are, who bring students out? Do most of you, because Alicia, when she gave her presentation, she talked about all these wonderful classes she does. And I do the same thing, and I'm just curious, do most towns have that? Because that's critical. Those are the people that are boots on the ground who are going to be able to tell you where these vernal pools are, when they're missing, and when they're drying up, and if they're drying up. I know they're going to be a critical link in the food chain, and we need to keep an eye on it. Yeah, Jens.
Judy, I just wanted to brag for a minute about Burlington and having Alicia as our naturalist. I mean, it's really tremendous to have access to that kind of knowledge and to have it infused into the city programming. And so I'm just tickled pink on that front. And then segueing to your not daytime job, Alicia, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about the Master Naturalist program and get that into the mix of how we can, how we can broaden the circle of folks who know about these things.
Yes, definitely.
Well, thank you. I'm kind of going back and forth between eating dinner and listening, but I will pay attention. But I agree with Judy that having people trained in the natural history of their town is really critical in terms of disseminating knowledge. I mean, we had this discussion on the talk the afternoon that I spoke, and I honestly wish that we had all grown up as Judy grew up, you know, really integrated in the land, and that field naturalists were not needed, but we need people like field naturalists and Vermont Master Naturalists to help raise literacy, really a forgotten language of the forest. And so there are these potential public walks. And like you said, Judy, having people in the right place at the right time and knowing what's going on the ground. It's hard to know about with vernal pools what to do, because that does feel like a climate change response. And my hope is many of these salamanders live many years. And I know, Jens, you've been to the pool that Judy's talking about, because I've seen you out there with your kids. And for those of you that don't know, it's behind the North Ave Alliance Church here in Burlington in the Arms Forest. And it was dry. And then it did fill later, but it was after the salamanders had been out looking for it, you know, so there was a mismatch of timing of the animals' response to the warm rain and the actual filling of that basin. And I don't know if it's partly because that pool is maybe connected to groundwater. I'm not quite sure exactly what went on in that particular spot, but in addition to the speaking, you know, Jens and Mark, I'd like to say that one of the nice responses of training a team of naturalists who then know each other and know their neighbors, know their town, is that they will often engage. We've had several people either restart conservation commissions or join the one where they belong. It's a way to energize a town, really, is to have 10, 15. In Burlington this year, there are 20 people training in the geology and the glacial history and the wildlife and the indigenous history and the settlement history, which we actually, in my experience, one of the most startling things to me was to actually see during settlement times how the city started on the Winooski River. You know, it was one of those many towns that were really arrived at by water, and people looked for the falls to create sources of power to run sawmills and grist mills. So we started on the Winooski River, then we pivoted to the waterfront as commerce grew and exchange started to happen. And then the mansions eventually popped up down here in the south end, which are now all of our neighborhoods. And so it's fun stuff to know. And I think it does allow people to work as teams to do riparian restoration, to do wildlife monitoring, to do grow wild native plant work, you know, as in community. So
Alicia, is there a telephone number or an address that you might put in the chat box that if a community was interested in having someone learn this process, this naturalist process that you're talking about?
Sure.
Is there a contact information a community might use? Yeah.
Yes. So the easiest way would be to email me, and I could, if you're interested in being a Vermont Master Naturalist, I could put you in touch with the closest town next fall, where program will be programming, or some of them may start in the spring, but they'll be programming starting spring and fall in different towns. And ultimately, we're trying to ripple out and go to other towns, you know, in Vermont. And I could keep you in mind as we might arrive in your area. Of course, the pandemic slowed us down a little bit, but we're figuring it out. But Judy, the short answer, and I will put this in the chat, but it's just Alicia, ALICIA, at vermontmasternaturalist.org would be
Awesome.
the way to reach out. And I'm really honored to be part of this Association of Vermont Conservation Commission Summit. And my hope is, you know, Jens and Mark and other members who are on this session, that we can start to work more closely with you on projects and, you know, start to refine our mission, really, to saving biodiversity and, you know,
Yeah.
teaching people about the next generation too, about the
And
land.
Alicia, we need to talk about that vernal pool because I believe it's connected with all the underground tunnels that are coming from the caves on the Interville side.
Oh,
Because
interesting.
there's at least 3 places where the soil's beginning to sink, where the caves are caving in.
Oh, I'd like to see that. Yes, we should go and walk.
Yeah,
It's my favorite.
because North Avenue is built on a sand dune.
Exactly.
Right.
An old delta. Yeah.
Exactly.
River.
So I'd love to take a walk and show you sometimes where they're all caving in.
I'll accept that invitation.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay, so both Alicia and Lynn talked about fragmentation of land and the wildlife and what's happening with the fragmentation of land or what's not happening. And I'm working with a school right now in Burlington, and there's a forest here, and then there's the school and the school playground, and there's a business behind the school, and there's another forest, Champlain School. And so the children are aware of fragmentation. So they have just planted a row of trees, a row of bushes and plants to create a channel for them to go from this piece of forest to this piece of forest. And I just was interested in what your communities are doing around helping connect these fragmented pieces of land where animals can't get across or get over to the other piece. One of the things we talked about with Alicia is Centennial Field in Burlington. There's like no way to get from Centennial Field to the Interville without walking across somebody's yard. And so again, that has to be part of your master plans. What are you going to do? I mean, this little nugget of conversation that we had on both Lynn's presentation and Alicia's presentation about fragmentation was so critical. It could have been easily missed because it was a sentence or two that got popped up in their statements. But it to wildlife, you know, they get caught in the roads. They just have no protective way to get from one piece of land to the other. So again, I'm curious, what's happened in your communities? What are you doing to help fight fragmentation? Any comments? Yes.
We have had one conversation in our Conservation Commission about a road crossing. So there's a large wetland on one side of the road and a smaller wetland on the other. And the landowner who's on our commission has told us about the animals that he's seen killed on the road. So we've begun the discussion. Do we ask the town to put up a roadside? Do we apply for grants to try to install some kind of culvert? We don't have an answer yet, but those are things that we're exploring.
Yeah, that's great. Alicia, I think it was you that talked about the culverts and getting pictures. They put trail cameras on each end to document who was using the.
Amazing.
Yeah.
No, it's really amazing how resourceful animals are and how faithfully they will find ways around crossing the road if those options are available, if the culverts are big enough and if they're kept open. There's so much to say about this topic, but I've been heartened in a way to read about what's going on out in Los Angeles and this giant land bridge they're building for millions of dollars to try to reconnect to cougar populations out there, you know, and it's just, you know, you can either go that route or you can try with some planning. And I do think VTrans has worked hard. I mean, Jens, this question should go to you. Like, what has been happening in Vermont generally around improving conditions for wildlife related to roads?
Please know that I understand Irene was a tragedy and a loss of life and horrible for a lot of people. it was also a real blessing for changing the hydrologic standards in Vermont and helping the Agency of Transportation to relearn a lesson that Vermonters have had to learn again and again. As if the 1927 flood wasn't enough for us, Irene needed to teach us that lesson again. And some stories, you know, Judy, you talk about the story coming back to the beginning. Well, Vermonters' relationship with flooding, we seem to go around and don't quite learn the lessons. But anyway, Irene really helped a lot. And with the new hydrologic standards of 1.1 times bankful, you know, that's how wide they sized the culvert for. Overwhelmingly, we're getting dry ground from terrestrial wildlife movement on these new structures that they're building. So this is a place where new infrastructure is better for climate than old infrastructure. This is where new building is a good thing because it can pass water, it can pass wildlife. It's at the intersection of two networks, the network of human movement and the network of wildlife movement and the network of water movement, frankly. And so, you know, that critical infrastructure really needs to be appropriately sized. But yeah, you know, the culvert work has been just so exciting to be a part of. And Vermont is really a nationally known, internationally known for our cooperation between our Fish and Wildlife Department and our Agency of Transportation.
Yeah.
Really, the problem is that we have 400,000 culverts in Vermont, and how many of them do we replace in a given year? You know, not that many. So it's the aging infrastructure that's the problem. And then speaking of Irene, all those bridges that washed out in 1927, well, they're all coming due for replacement about right now. So the fact that we kind of have this cyclical repair cycle with our infrastructure that's really costly. So, you know, here's a place where national politics and that infrastructure bill really would have a lot to do, good things for Vermont's climate resilience.
And Linda, one thing that I don't want to get missed is during Alicia's conversation, we had this big discussion around field cameras, or what's the other name they call them, Alicia?
Well, trail cameras, their historic name is game camera, but we feel like that's sort of thinking it's the deer you're going to shoot. So we usually call them trail cameras. So,
okay. So
yeah.
anyways, Linda, what I was thinking is in planning, if you might put a culvert in there, setting up some of those trail cameras to figure out where they're crossing and who's crossing would be amazing, I would think. I mean, I bought one to see who was stealing my mailbox and it was like $60. So it's a relatively inexpensive way to figure out where they're crossing and who's crossing, to figure out the size of the culvert and where it should go. Yes.
I can tell you that the landowner will be totally receptive to that. The wetlands that he has in his backyard are active with beavers right now. And our Green River Watershed Alliance just sponsored a workshop on Sunday, and we had about 40 people come to see the beaver activity there. He does have game cams set up to watch that, so I'm sure he would be, what's the new word I'm supposed to use?
I don't want to police this, but lately I've been calling them trail cameras.
Okay, trail cams, yeah. And so I think he would be very willing to do that, and that's a good idea.
Yeah, I think that would help. So I don't know, are we coming to a close? Because there's one thing I want to say. What time does this end?
We have plenty of time. We announced the meeting as 7 to 9, but whatever is fine.
Okay, perfect. Now let's keep talking because this is good. Everybody's on a roll. Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to bring up too is, are you all aware of the environmental justice bill that was just proposed in the legislation? It's called S-148. There's all these things in it that address social equity for people and the land. There was not one word that addresses equity for the land. Not one word. And I just wanted to bring that to your attention because we're going to need lots of voices. We had a panel discussion at Middlebury last week around this topic, and people were really interested, including land in this bill, but we're going to need voices to talk about it. So I was hoping you could do some investigative work and figure out what it is, and let people know that you're interested in that as well.
Judy,
So, yeah,
what was that bill number again, please?
S 148.
Thank you.
Keisha Ram presented it or proposed it or whatever you call it.
Mhm.
And it's going to be important. Let's see. So the other thing that we talked about in Alicia's group was the importance of storytelling, and that the storyteller has a really important role to play in telling the stories. And as Mark mentioned in the beginning, your handbook has success stories in it. And I don't know how those success stories got to Mark, but or to the handbook, but your success stories should be shared with your community at the minimum, because those stories are the root of your work, and they're the root of survival.
Mhm.
And people are like resilient. We want to be resilient. We want to be resilient. But they reach a time where they need to adapt. Resilience isn't enough. As the flooding keeps coming, look at what happened to the southern part of the state that depends on tourism. This year they had no color. They got so much rain on their leaves, they got a fungus. And the color totally just was brown on the trees down there.
Mhm.
So resilience can only go so far, and adaptation is going to have to step in at some point. People are going to have to really consider that. Oh, they put the link in the chat box. That's good. Thank you. And yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about that, resilience and adaptation. What are you doing for resilience within your communities and adapting within your communities to help make it through the Narrows? Because climate change is coming. You do realize, you guys that live in Guilford and down there, the climatologists are forecasting more rain for the southern part of the state. And you're going to get awful sick of rebuilding, being resilient. You're going to reach a point where you have to adapt. And adaptation, unfortunately, is going to be a big part of your world.
Well, I don't know if I want to tell you a story, but I can confirm that beginning in July, we had a lot of rain, and our ground has been saturated the whole month. So any new rain that came just ran off the hillsides and filled the rivers. So we've had high water, through almost every rainstorm. Much different. No problem with vernal pools down here. They're still full. So.
And Eric, do you want to address that? The rain running off the hillsides into the river, what's bringing that into the river, and what's going to happen, and all of that. I mean,
thanks,
right?
Judy. Yeah. So, so stormwater is definitely an issue for water quality, not just for Lake Champlain, but for lakes around the state and the region. These more intense rainstorms that we're experiencing in the region now create more erosion, and then ultimately carry more pollutants like nutrients and whatever else is on the landscape into our lakes, rivers, and lakes and ponds. And while I got the floor, I'll just add that I saw our state climatologist, Leslie Ann Giroux at UVM. She posted a drought report for the state a few weeks ago, I guess it was now, and most of the state, with the exception of, I think it was Grand Isle, maybe, but all Franklin County and maybe Western Essex County and Northern Lamoille County was all out of the drought or abnormally dry conditions is now considered to be in normal conditions as far as drought is concerned. Those other 3 counties are now considered abnormally dry, which is like the next tier up in their categorization system. There's like 3 more levels before like sort of intense drought or something like that. But before July, the whole state was definitely in at least abnormally dry, if not whatever the next couple of tiers up in the category are. And that definitely affects everything. The water levels, as you mentioned, Judy, the vernal pools, that didn't even hurt me when I was walking around. Yeah, it was very dry. It helped with mosquitoes. The spring was great for mosquitoes, as I'm swatting at mosquitoes on my wall here now. But yeah, there's definitely impacts to all over the place.
Yes, Laurel.
Yeah, I'm at the northern end of Windham County, where Linda's down at the southern end next to Massachusetts. And I just was going to say at the beginning of July, we were abnormally dry. And then we got over 20 inches of rain here, ending with 5.5 inches at my house on July 29th. And we saw landslides that we've never seen in places, just the ground is so wet. We had slumping and slides, including behind the house that we just sold 2 years ago, a house that's been there for 170 years. And a major landslide happened and the house is unlivable and will probably go, just it's a matter of time. So to me, that's it's been a wake-up call for people around here in Rockingham for climate change. This is one of the footprints of climate change for us. And just trying to work with the town. One of the things that we've done, not so much with the Conservation Commission, but Sustainable Rockingham here, worked with the town hazard mitigation plan and included the 14 effects of climate change that are in the state hazard mitigation plan. We now have them written into our local hazard mitigation plan. And I strongly encourage people to consider doing that and welcome people to contact me if they want to hear how we did it. I'm sure every town will do their own way, but it's one of the ways to put climate change squarely in front of town officials and elected officials and town staff.
It's so important. The first step, I think, Laurel, is people have to acknowledge it. And that takes a while to get people to acknowledge that it's here. It's not gonna be a one-shot deal like the flood of 27 and be gone. It's here. We have to deal with it. And so once they acknowledge, that's great that you've done that. I hope others contact you and follow up with the same path, because mitigation is, I don't know how to even plan. How do you plan for a 170-year-old house sliding off a bank? It's been there 170 years, it just seems impossible to think that you could even plan for that.
Mhm.
Amazing.
We
Yeah.
could also talk about temperature. It's October 20th and we haven't had a frost in the southern part of the state. It was 70 degrees today. It feels great to be able to work outside. My morning glories are still blooming every morning, and but it's a real change.
Mhm.
Yeah, it is for sure. The latest frost we had on Mount Mansfield was October 6th. And last night they had snow. So it's getting later and later and later for the frost, and earlier that you can plant, right? So that may seem good for those with gardens, but it's also going to change. And change the land we live on. How are we going to adapt to that?
Yeah.
What
I don't know, Judy. I've got zucchini going in my garden still, and I was done with zucchini in early August. It's not fair, and I still have zucchini in the garden in August.
I know, I still have
October 28th.
tomatoes. I'm like, I am so sick of tomatoes. I know, it's true. Yes, Laurel.
Well, the other thing that I have become aware of this year is we have more what they call tropical nights, nights where the temperature does not go down below 68. And in the past, we've traditionally here had about 5 of those a year. And by 2050, I think it is, we're likely to have 30 or more. This summer, we had 5 in a row. And it was just stunning. Those weren't the only ones we had this year, but to have those nights were sleepless nights, really. So
Yeah.
tropical night makes it sound kind of sexy and fun.
Yeah.
But for me, there's sleepless nights, and people who don't have air conditioning are suffering and can die from not being able to get cool enough to
Yeah.
sleep.
Yeah, and that's that whole urban heat island thing too. In planning, Burlington is high on the list of cities with urban heat islands, and so what happens is when you create a community, it's most often on the margins of towns where they don't have trees in the green belts between the sidewalk and the houses, and they don't have parks, and they're on the margins, and there's no transportation for them, and they don't have banks and stores, and they have to walk. You see a high rate of diabetes and heat exhaustion, and most of them are tenement houses, so they don't have AC. The little fan in the window just blows in hot air, so they never get a good night's sleep. And so consequently, there's becoming more and more places in Burlington like that. And so when you're planning these communities, because there's so much discussion about let's compress everything into to eliminate sprawl, let's put it in the community, the town center, right? And so all this discussion about moving everything into the town center, you got to still continue to prepare for, there has to be a way in the night, the tropical night, whatever you call it, to have that heat leave. And if there's no trees and evaporation can't happen, that heat doesn't leave, it just sits there. And so that kind of planning has to happen within that town center, whatever they're calling it, town, when they move everybody closer to town, I forget what they call it. But yeah, so there has to be some planning around that as well, so that we can eliminate those heat islands. They're
urban migration.
Yeah, that's another urban. I'm working with a class where, and they their homework assignment last week was to pull out an article from someplace on someone who's migrated here because of climate change. And 65 kids came with basically 50 articles of why people were moving here because of climate change. And, when they move here, what they're going to want to do right off the bat is create an environment that they had. And of course, that environment that they had is what triggered all the problems, right? The fires and the flooding, all of that is because their wants were so much greater than their needs. It's made a huge problem. So now they're moving here. We have to keep control of our wants and our needs.
There was interesting work done out at the University of Oregon. I think I'd have to look it up for sure, but it was called the Oregon Experiment, and this was years ago. They've already done a lot of studies about what it takes to design an environmentally friendly city or urban area, and yet we continue to use wrong-headed approaches to such things, which really surprised me sometimes because a lot of the work has already been done.
Yeah, we tend to repeat more than we learn from history, don't we?
But I think we have this unique opportunity with COVID, and COVID in some ways has shown us what sustainability looks like. My telecommuting, the way that we've taken a bunch of parking spaces and street space in Burlington and made it pedestrian space. The way we've taken sidewalk space and allowed it to become restaurants. I mean, a lot of, maybe those aren't all the best resilience examples, but whatever. There's been a lot of change that I think is positive and is showing us what a climate future needs to look like.
Yes, exactly. And it's like I said earlier to Laurel's comment, we have to acknowledge it first. And look how long it took us to acknowledge we were in COVID. And but we did. And we've made great gains in that process. We're now adapting to allow people to work at home and find balance between in-person and Zoom. And it's great. It's great, I think. I think it is. So Erin talked about orchids. I'm just wondering, because Lynn talked about protecting rare species. Do any of you have programs, or are you addressing within your communities how to protect rare species? No, Erin, I just loved what you said about the the program you were brought to our attention. I just like that. I didn't know if anybody else had anything. Yes. Oops, I should say yes to who? Linda, go ahead, and then Mark, you can go.
We've been working with a naturalist from the Bonneville Environmental Center in Guilford to do a natural resources inventory. So she's been doing a lot of field work and documenting things that she finds. Our question now is how to best share that information with the community. And I think some of it should be outdoor programs that we host. Some of it should be maps and information presented on our town website, but that's under discussion in the next year for us. So
nice. Yeah, they're doing some great work. They just sent out a flyer, and it was all about programs connected with Halloween. And they're doing some great stuff around owls. And there was a pond that in, I think it's Wilmington, a pond that broke, the dam part broke and washed out. And they're making it into a mystery tour for Halloween to follow the pond and why it broke. And those kinds of things to bring reality to people are so interesting. I think it's such a great way to do that. That's wonderful. Mark?
I was going to say here in Ripon, we have some folks that monitor Jacob's Ladder. And there's another plant that the name eludes me all of a sudden, but it doesn't matter. So we're monitoring that. We've mapped it. They are monitored on a regular basis as far as their health. Are they expanding? Are they contracting, et cetera? And that information is shared with the community and also used when we look at developing conservation districts and zoning, et cetera. And I'm going to tie it back to, it's interesting because they are threatened by some of our introduced species. So we have to balance between how do we protect them, right? Recognizing these other plants that are moving in. But it's very interesting, and people in town are interested in it. And as I said, we use it to drive some decisions around conservation districts and zoning, et cetera. But we do put that information out there for the town people to know about.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, because, there'll come a time in your town where you'll need a vote on something. And if you've spent the time to educate the town, it's going to help with that vote and whatever it is. So it's really good to spend time. Bethany, did you have your hand up?
And then Eric.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in Cornwall, we did a natural resource inventory quite some time ago. And, you know, it was really great after we did it. And the town seemed really thoroughly behind us and interested. And now that has waned. And I know that there are some rare species, I know sort of where they are, but the landowners really aren't interested. And so it's really frustrating. You know, I feel as though it's becoming more and more urgent to actually get people educated and aware of what is where and what's possible. But I mean, we do have some new members on the Conservation Commission, but I don't know, it's frustrating. So
Bethany, are they not interested because they're afraid if somebody finds out there's a rare plant there, it might dictate how they can use their land?
yes, that is absolutely it.
So what, as a commission, can you do about that?
Nothing.
No, there's no laws or anything? Because I know my backyard, my backyard is 100 acres, but my backyard, there are plants, medicinal plants I harvest all the time. And I also know they're endangered, but they're not endangered in my backyard. I mean, they are plentiful in my backyard, and I have no qualms about harvesting them. But then it's just my backyard. Nobody really knows or cares what's in my backyard.
Well, this specific one is in a project that there are two landowners and they want to develop it, and there's been a lot of opposition, and that's so the owners, you know, would be thrilled if those rare plants vanished. And so, and I don't even know that there's a way for us to go and look.
Now, I don't know if this is possible. Some of you might know, but is there a way to transplant some of those to somewhere else where there could be safe?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I can
I mean,
find out.
maybe there's public property or public park or trails or someplace that has the same kind of environment that you might try transferring some of them. And if they take, then transfer more.
Right.
I mean,
It's
it's just an idea.
That's
pretty
yeah.
good time of year for seed collecting. I don't know if they're seed bearing plants.
Yeah, that's true too.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
I mean, because I know it's like, so here's this isn't a, well, maybe it is a rare plant. Have you guys ever heard of sweetgrass? It's a
Yeah.
grass that Native people use in baskets. Well,
Great sweetgrass.
yeah.
Robin Walls Kemmerer.
Yes, yes. Okay, so sweetgrass has adapted and survived here in Vermont because it used to grow along the shores of the Champlain Sea, right? It likes estuaries, it likes salt water. And so it has adapted and it still grows here, but it's typically the size of grass. But we're putting so much salt on our roads, and we're creating a brackish environment in the ditches now, so we can find sweetgrass in the ditches for our baskets.
Huh.
That's a great story.
So that might be something that you might want to look for in your ditches too, because Cornwall was, you know, definitely a native area, right?
Mm-hmm.
Eric.
Thanks, Judy. Just on the rare and threatened species topic. So I guess I have two things. On the point you were just making about moving plants. I don't know so much about moving rare plants, but in the fish world, there's the fisheries biologists will occasionally move some rare fish upstream and out of an area that's going to be treated to manage sea lamprey. For example, like mud puppies in the Memorial River, I think it was a recent case where the fisheries biologists collected mud puppies in the lower reaches of the Memorial River where the lampricide application was going to happen. Mud puppies are susceptible to this lampricide.
Yeah.
And they were moved upstream out of the treatment area. To be honest, I haven't heard how that worked out, but that's another example.
Yeah, I don't know if there's laws about doing that or if there are people that will even help you with. There might be people that could help you do that, Bethany. Who knows? But if he's concerned, see if he can help you, see if he can work with you, let you there to collect seeds or transplant plants or, whatever. Yeah.
And then in the case of Williston, Williston does have a rare, threatened, endangered species GIS layer that we work with and we refer to it when we are reviewing new projects that are proposed for development here in town. And whenever a project or a parcel, I should say, hits something on that rare, threatened, endangered species layer, we require the developer to hire a biologist to do a survey or assessment of that parcel for that species, and then report back on it. So we make a decision based on the outcome of that assessment. And also, I hope that this new significant wildlife habitat area layer that Jens has been working with us on is able to serve as a meta-analysis for that too, so we can manage these things on something greater than just a parcel by parcel level.
So what happens, Eric, to the developer where the biologist comes and looks and says, yep, this is really rare, we got to protect it? What happens to the developer? Can he sell that land still, or is it truly protected?
And so that's a good question. And we had a case, I don't know, within the past like 2 years or so, where there was a parcel proposed for, I don't know what the development was, a subdivision for a house or something. And there was a rare species, I think it was a rare plant species that was identified for that area. And in that case, it was the parcel was large enough that the developer was able to move the proposed location of the house. I think it was well away from where that plant was located, to the point where we were comfortable recommending that project was okay to move forward because they had taken the appropriate measures to protect that habitat for that particular plant. That's really the one example I can think of off the top of my head now at this point.
So Bethany, does that help you? Does that give you an idea too? I guess. Bethany?
Yeah, it does. I mean, the thing about living in a small town is living in a small town. And so, like one of the people is my next door neighbor, and we don't actually get along very well. So it would be very tricky for me to say, would you mind if I go in your woods on this other piece of property for this? I don't know that, maybe somebody else could ask that question.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, the small town politics is tough. I know.
Yeah.
Aaron.
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to not put on my state hat, but I'm going to put on my hat as a botanist for Vermont Fish and Wildlife. Judy, I work for Bob Pop, actually. I know you know him.
I do know. Bob and I go back and round.
So I was regarding a lot of the process. I think Eric kind of outlined the way that it can often work with rare plants. So you have a contractor or someone who's sort of often negotiates and figures out what can be done. Often the best solution is to be able to like move the parking lot or move something to a place that the plants aren't going to be affected. The state Vermont Fish and Wildlife does not generally. I think Vermont's Fish and Wildlife sees transplanting endangered plants or rare plants as a last resort, and it's not something I would just recommend doing on your own. So it's something, and part of the main reason for that is that the survival rate of transplanting is really low. Maybe 30, and it depends on the species. Some do better than others. So it may be 30 or 50% of them survive for a couple of years, but then like the long term, often it's just that we don't understand these systems well enough or what the plants really need. So if we try to guess where the plants would be happy, usually the majority of times, or where they'll be happy enough to keep reproducing and have these long sustaining populations for decades rather than just for a few years, without just gardening them, we just usually aren't successful and don't know how to do that. So, so our major recommendation is to keep the plants in the same place if possible, and that is a last resort in some cases. In which case, yeah, there are ways to work through doing that. The Cornwall inventory is probably one of the most significant town inventories I've actually ever seen cross my desk in the 14 years I've worked for the state. So it's really, really significant, a lot of the things that were found in that inventory. So I'm glad you're paying attention, and I'm glad you care about it, because yeah, I think it's really important. And if you need someone to help talk with Lynn, I mean, I don't know how helpful I'd be, but I'd be happy to at least try to, or if you want, if it would be helpful to have someone from the state, it might be the opposite of helpful, but if it is helpful, I'd be happy to chat with you or with landowners.
I think conversation is always helpful.
Could you put your information in the chat, Erin?
Yeah, sure.
Great. Thank you.
Bethany, I think it's also time for celebration, right? And what was so great about the Cornwall inventory was that air of celebration. And and then again for the community values mapping, there was incredible energy in town, and it's making the choice to celebrate what you've got and to get other people on board celebrating it. And that leads to that commonality and that common sense of value, of shared values, that I think is so important for getting you past conflict. And so I really think that, when in doubt, celebrate. Do a Walks and Talks series, whatever it is, but make sure it has that air of celebration to it. And you can celebrate different scales of your landscape, or different cultural and natural, places, or whatever it might be. But just pick something and celebrate it and involve as many people as you can.
Exactly.
And I think that's the way to jumpstart things back again in Cornwall. Because, I've seen it in Cornwall 3 or 4 times. I've been working in the state since 2006. And I've seen Cornwall come and go and come and go. And I think celebration is key. Sorry to keep talking.
No, I think it's awesome. I'm like really excited about all these relationships that are being made tonight and all these connections to help each community. I think it's awesome. It just seems like a real annual meeting, right? Sitting back and talking and sharing business cards and emails. It's great. I think it's awesome. Yeah, so did anybody else have anything they wanted to share about rare species?
I guess I would like to just say something, and it reflects as celebration back on Jens. Jens, I was just out with Shelby Perry from the Northeast Wilderness Trust, and she's walking an 80-mile trek. You know this story, from the Worcester Range up to the Northeast Kingdom, celebrating a new wildlife preserve, the Woodbury Wilderness Preserve, in that important corridor that you helped identify through Staying Connected many years ago. So I guess what I would say too, and to everyone and to you, Bethany, is things add up in ways that we don't even know yet they're going to. So it's, as long as we keep speaking our truth about the importance of plants and animals and identifying places that would be good to conserve, things can work out in our favor. So I'll stop there. And I actually am going to need to get off the call, but I so enjoyed this, and thank you, Judy, and thank you, Jens and Mark, for hosting us. So,
And thank you for sharing, Alicia.
yeah. Well, I hope to see you all again in the field.
For the next annual meeting.
There's
Thanks. One of the things that Lynn talked about was she talked a lot about dogs on trails, on community trails. And I know here in Essex, recently on Front Porch Forum, we had a letter of a woman whose child had been bitten by a dog, because they have a unleashed. Your dog doesn't have to be in leash; it has to be in voice control. And the woman said, "Well, I've got to take her to get stitches. Please, here's my email. Please give me a call to tell me the information about, or please let me know the information about your dog shots and stuff." And the person never called back. And so they were advertising to try to get this person to talk to them because they were concerned about shots for the child, right? And so I know I've tried to do classes at Indian Brook, and it's really difficult with the dogs because kids are so afraid sometimes. And you don't know if the dog is friendly or not when they're around children. And so I'm just curious, do you have rules or regulations about dogs on community trails in your, because I know down in the Brattleboro area, they're working on making Abenaki historical trails and other historical trails down there. And I'm curious, is because Lynn was talking about the problem with dogs. They keep them out of certain places because they're impacting the nesting and the dens of wildlife. So I'm curious how you all feel about that.
We just have one trail that we manage in our town. We don't have any dog guidelines except to clean up after your dog, but we're a small town, so not running into problems with overuse or too many people on the trail. So no problems yet, but I can see what you're talking about.
Yeah, especially if you're going to get new trails down in that area too, right? Yeah. So nobody else has, in Burlington, what happens in Burlington? Do they have on the trails rules about dogs? Yeah.
Yeah.
In Burlington, they have to be on leash. It's not that everybody abides by that rule, but theoretically, at least, they have to be on leash. And if they're not, you could get in trouble for such. I know we're pretty persistent in keeping our dog on the leash, but that doesn't go for everybody.
Well, that's
Yeah,
good to
and
know. Eric?
In Williston, right on Key My four-legged beach, just came in to ask to go out. In Williston, we have a number of different trail networks, each of which has some layer of rules around dogs, and some are require a leash to be the dogs to be leashed. Others allow for dogs to be off leash and voice control, and generally speaking, the trail networks that we have the most problems with are those with the dogs allowed to be off leash and voice control. It's usually because the dogs just are not under voice control and they're running all over the place and creating havoc. Particularly in those, we have one trail network, Pine Tree Hill, that is kind of a patchwork of town-owned land and also private land. And the trail kind of weaves through both types of land or ownership. And there's a few places where the trail kind of comes close to some of the houses, and that's when we're going to see problems and start to see a lot of complaints. And dogs really start running into those houses and causing problems over there. And then it's just a perpetual issue with people actually going to the trouble of fitting up and bagging in pet space and then leaving the bag on the side of the trail. Mystery that baffles many of us, never actually bring it home with them.
Yeah. The other thing that Lynn talked about that I thought was really interesting was she spoke about a specific, I can't remember the name of it, a specific area. And she talked about using permitting to evaluate whether the project was really protecting the land or not. So when people wanted to do a project on the trail or near the trail or, you know, in a protected area, they had a permitting process to do the project. And again, I know at Indian Brook, Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts and all these little organizations come and they build shelters or they plant plants and they change the ecosystem when they plant daffodils and stuff like that along the trail. So I was curious because she really felt that permitting process was important. And so I was curious about permitting. Do most towns have permitting?
Again, we don't have permitting, but we did convene a meeting last year about all the people in town who use the trail, the one public trail in town. And we set up an understanding of who should be contacted. In this case, we decided it's the Conservation Commission. If another group is going to use it to tell us about it first, you know, so that we can talk about impacts or conflicts or whatever. So not permitting, but an agreement of understanding.
No, good. Yeah, because sometimes doing, you know, what they think is doing good is not really doing good. It's doing harm, right? And so that's good. That's good that you're on top of that. Anybody else? Yeah, we haven't heard from you, Ned, tonight.
Yeah, been quiet, Judy. Yeah, this is a bit of a pet peeve of mine, I suppose, but I'm in Montpelier, and there's several lovely parks, and I've been participating in a long-term bird monitoring station or a series of projects with the Forest Bird Monitoring Project. And so I go out every spring and I'm counting forest birds to watch populations change over time and understand what's happening. And then a local group approached the Parks Commission about wouldn't it be neat to have more mountain bike trails in the park. And I didn't even hear about it until they had already approved it, of course. But the parks are becoming increasingly laced by little curlicue trails that actually went right to my station and around another station. And now when I go out in the morning before dawn, you know, to monitor for birds, you know, certainly by the time I'm finished with my project, I have bicycles running through the forest all around me. It's quite remarkable. I wish that the Conservation Commission and the Parks Commission, they're both, you know, good people trying to do good work, but there still isn't a master plan that integrates the natural resource inventory and the multiple and sometimes conflicting uses, and even understands where there's ongoing research projects that had been agreed to in decades past. So anyway, it's complex stuff. It'd be really nice to keep revisiting that together.
Have you noticed a decrease in the birds since the trails came?
Well, yes, but it's only been a couple of years since they've been in place. So, it really is not fair enough to do it statistically in terms of knowing the change is authentic or not. But it certainly is. Seems like less and less stuff every time I'm there.
Are you talking about the park behind the Capitol?
The park behind the Capitol is Hubbard Park.
Yeah.
This is actually a slightly different section of the park system, to the east side of the North Branch, coming down from Wrightsville. Yeah, there's a whole beautiful section of forested woodland up there.
Well, because in Hubbard Park, I've noticed a lot of new trails. And the thing about Hubbard Park, however you say it, is that that's a highly sensitive archaeological site, that whole park. Because the town is actually built on an interval, and to us, it was our common pot. It was our wahana. It was our place where we went to get food, the place where the animals went to get food. And we didn't really live there. We lived up on the high spot because it always flooded there, right? Which is exactly why Montpelier has to have a bucket loader at each confluence of each little branch that goes there to break the ice up, because they shouldn't be there. They're in the bottom of 100-foot lake that used to be there. But anyways, I've noticed a lot of trails up there too, and it's changing. And is there, when these trails are made, is there a connection with the Division of Historic Preservation and the archaeological sites? Because the forest you're talking about is the same way.
Yeah, Judy, I'm sorry to say, but I can't imagine. I think a lot of what goes up in the park right now is a series of methodical trails, thoughtful trails, but probably not archaeologically researched. And then lots of renegade random trails that are just great shortcuts for bikes. And then lots of other trails where people just tramp. It's very, very highly used. It's a wonderful thing and a tragic thing at the same time.
Yeah.
So, but I don't think there's any thought about the archaeological long-term human meaning of that site.
Rarely are things that coordinated within the state, sadly. And I mean, I think that's something that we have to work towards, be more persistent about, because I know there's a disjunct between different departments of the state when it comes to conservation efforts on any given piece of land.
But
And that's all municipal at that too, yeah.
The Division of Historic Preservation is just down the road, right? And so it's just something that should be considered too when you're doing that, or when not you but others. Yeah, it makes for a touchy subject. Thanks for sharing. Anybody else have any comments on that? No, this has been great. You've answered all my questions.
Judy,
Yeah.
do you know anything about archaeological history in Blanchard Park? It's a really obscure park in Montpelier, but it's one they're doing a plan on right now.
Give me a.
It's on
what?
It's also just above the intervale, the river. It's on basically a giant clay mound from the old, eroding lake bed of Lake Vermont, or the other Lake Winooski. Yeah, but it's so it's just a little bit elevated above. It's a small area. It's sort of just, I guess, behind the city hall, like a steep hill. But I know they're doing the city's doing a review right of what they want to do there.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, so.
And I hope that what they do is nothing, but we'll see.
Anything where there's clay, there's community. Because that's pottery was so important, right? Yeah, I would make a call to the Division of Historic Preservation. I mean, it's not going to hurt. Scott Dillon is one of the state archaeologists. He can help you there. And Jesse Robinson, they're great people.
Yeah,
Um,
I know Jesse.
Yeah, and just give them a jingle and say, hey, look, they're considering this. I'm wondering, I mean, I have access to the archaeological reports too, so I could tell you exactly, but they're going to be 100 times better than I am. And it should be considered, at least questioned. You know, they have various phases, right? They might do a walkover and see if they see any artifacts, and depending on what they see, they might do phase 1. Depending on what they find, they might do phase 2. And so it gets a little more complex with each phase. But anything connected with clay is going to be an important site, especially since there's so many sites at Hubbard Park.
Thank you, Judy.
Yeah, no problem. Well, I know we have about 10 minutes. Anybody have questions for me?
Yeah, Judy, I would like to, well, first of all, thank you for summarizing the other parts of this conference. I wasn't able to attend any except yours. And I would like to say how much I appreciated that. You left me with a lot of food for thought. I've shared some of the images that you created for all of us, your description of the Narrows, your little story about how you used to be able to ice skate from the island you lived on to Burlington. I know you seem to be reading from a prepared talk. Would you be willing to share that talk? And I'm asking because I would like to tell our Conservation Commission about some of the things you shared, and I can either refer them to the recording.
Yeah, you have a copy of it, Mark?
Yes.
The first one I did?
Yes, I do.
Can you share it with anybody who would like it? Linda, Bethany, you have their emails?
If you all just want to email me, I will send it out. Mark, I can get it from you because I have all of your emails.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So
Jens,
anyone
'cause
who wants
I
it,
was
just-
looking at your square trying to figure out the best way to do this.
Yeah, because I worked with Linda and Bethany. So if Linda, Bethany, if you just shoot me an email and remind me, no problem at all. And anyone else who
Right,
wants
and
it.
So
I guess the offer goes to everyone on if you'd like it, send an email
Yeah.
to Jens.
So if you Google, Linda too, if you Google Marlborough College and Judy Dow, I published it in the Potash book. You know that Marlborough College's Potash magazine? The original story is published in there. And the part 2 of the original story is published in the Vermont Almanac. And part 3 is going to be published in the Vermont Almanac this year.
Thank you very much. And thank you for sharing the talk in this forum. I really appreciated it.
You know, I think it's good too. Thank you, Linda. I think it's good to try to make your annual meeting something where it really is, where you get and talk to each other, right? And so I'm glad that Mark was open to listening to that proposal when I suggested it, and so it was, I feel good about it. Thank you. Any other questions for me? Okay. Well, I hope
Judy,
you-
if I could, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. You have
No,
one
I
more
was going
thing?
to just tell everybody have a good evening, or the rest of it anyways.
Well, I will say this, I've only been, this is my, I guess Jens, think about how many years I've been on the board. This is my 4th or 5th annual summit. But the first 3 were in person. And I can tell you, there was nowhere near as much discussion when we were in person as we had today when we were virtual. So I really, I learned a lot. And I learned a lot to take forward when we're planning for next year, how we can continue this. it's nice that we had a small group of people. I wish we had more people, but on the other hand, it might have inhibited the type of discussion we had, but I think more people would have benefited from this. So I appreciate you offering yourself and your time and your experience and stories to share with us, and to share this approach to having a discussion. So thank you.
Thank you. And I learned a lot too. I really did. When I was listening to Lynn and Alicia, and what was her name? Zabatra? When I
It's
was
Zapata.
Zapata, whatever.
Yes.
When I was listening to the three of them talk, I was thinking, oh, I can so relate to that. I could see what they were saying. I could smell and taste what they were talking about. And so it was really nice to be a part of that. I learned a lot. It was great. And that's what I was trying to share with you all tonight, because I know our busy lives don't allow us to get to all of those things. So it was good.
And thank you, Judy, for the information on the S-148 too. I'm going to try to follow that up, and I think it'll be of interest to Andrea in particular because of her, the things she's active in.
Yeah, yeah. I think it should be of interest to everybody, because there needs to. It's environmental justice should include environmental justice for the land.
I agree with you 100%. All our relations.
That's right. So you all
Yeah.
have a good evening. It was so nice meeting you all. And should I put my email in the chat? Does anybody want that?
Oh, yes, yes, I would.
Okay, let me figure this out here. It's not. Well, I would do it if my computer would let me, but it's not letting me get to the bottom of the page. I'm like, what's going on here? There we go. It's jdowbasket@aol.com. I've been making baskets for 55 years. There's 278 materials that I harvest in the woods for my baskets.
Wow. That's great.
Thank you again, Judy.
Thank you. You all have a good
Yes.
evening.
And
Thank you
yes,
Yes.
so
Take care,
much.
everybody.
Thank you, everybody, for joining
Bye.
us tonight and for your